In this story, Alexander, a successful but emotionally distant man, reconnects with Sophia, his long-lost love, and discovers a son he never knew existed. Together, they navigate the pain of the past and the promise of a future they never imagined. It's a journey of healing, forgiveness, and the transformative power of family. A story about second chances and love that endures. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Let's begin. The city park was alive with the kind of vibrant energy that made even the most weary of hearts feel lighter. Lush greenery spread in every direction, and the golden hues of the setting sun bathed the surroundings in a warm, peaceful glow. Children dashed between the trees, their laughter mingling with the occasional bark of dogs and the gentle murmur of conversations. Couples strolled hand in hand along winding paths, their faces softened by the serenity of the evening. Amid this idyllic scene, Alexander Hayes stood apart from the crowd. His tailored shirt and polished shoes made him an unusual sight in the relaxed atmosphere of the park. Normally, Alexander wouldn't have ventured into such a place, not with the relentless demands of running a tech empire. Yet today was different. For the first time in what felt like years, he'd left his phone at home, abandoning the ever-present weight of emails, meetings, and decisions. He craved solitude, a moment to breathe, to remind himself of a world beyond boardrooms and spreadsheets. As he walked along a cobblestone path, his gaze wandered aimlessly until it landed on a lively little boy chasing bubbles near a large oak tree. The child, no older than 8, leaped and twirled with unrestrained joy, his laughter ringing out like a melody. The sheer exuberance of the moment brought a rare smile to Alexander's lips. He paused, captivated, as the boy tried to catch a particularly elusive bubble, only to trip and land on the grass with a giggle. A few feet away, a woman sat on a wooden bench, her head bent over a book. Her serene presence drew Alexander's attention next. There was something calming about the way she seemed lost in her own world, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders and the soft curves of her face relaxed in concentration. She looked up briefly, her eyes flickering toward the boy, a small smile gracing her lips before she returned to her reading. Alexander's curiosity deepened, but before he could turn away, the boy's gaze met his. Large, inquisitive eyes studied him for a moment, and then, to Alexander's surprise, the boy began walking toward him, his small feet crunching the gravel path. "Hey, mister," the boy called out, his voice clear and bright. Alexander glanced around, half expecting the child to be addressing someone else. But the boy's determined approach left no doubt. He crouched slightly to meet the boy's level. "Hello," Alexander replied, his tone cautious but warm. "Can I help you?" The boy grinned mischievously, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "My mom has a picture of you in her purse." Alexander froze, a mix of surprise and confusion flashing across his face. Of all the things he'd expected, this wasn't one of them. "A picture of me?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Are you sure it's me?" The boy nodded enthusiastically. "Yep, it's you, all right? I saw it." A faint chuckle escaped Alexander as he struggled to make sense of the situation. Before he could respond, the boy turned and pointed toward the bench where the woman sat. "That's my mom over there," the boy explained proudly. "You can ask her." Alexander's gaze followed the direction of the boy's finger, and his breath caught in his throat. The woman had lifted her head from her book, her expression shifting from calm curiosity to something unreadable. The golden light of the evening framed her features, and recognition hit him like a bolt of lightning. Though time had etched faint lines around her eyes, her face was unmistakable. Memories, long buried beneath the weight of ambition and success, flooded back in an instant. "Sophia?" he murmured under his breath, barely audible even to himself. Sophia, the woman he had once known so intimately, the woman he had let slip away in the relentless pursuit of his career. Now she was here, and beside her stood a boy with the same infectious energy and curiosity that had once drawn him to her. Sophia's lips parted slightly, as if she was about to speak, but she hesitated. Her expression shifted, first to guarded caution, then to something softer, more familiar. Alexander straightened, his heart pounding as he realized this unexpected encounter would be far more than a casual moment in the park. Alexander's mind raced as he stood rooted to the spot, his eyes fixed on Sophia. Time seemed to warp, stretching out the seconds into something unending. Was it really her? The woman he had loved so deeply, yet ultimately let go in the chaos of his meteoric rise to success? Mom, the boy called out, his voice breaking Alexander's reverie. The boy, full of enthusiasm, waved to his mother, beckoning her over. Mom, this is the man from your picture. Sophia closed her book carefully, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she needed an extra moment to collect herself. When she finally stood, Alexander noticed how the years had softened her, her once youthful energy now replaced by a calm confidence. But her guarded expression was unmistakable, a shield erected for reasons he could only begin to guess. As she approached, she locked eyes with him, her lips pressed into a thin line. Alexander tried to decipher her thoughts, but they remained an enigma. Sophia, he said finally, his voice low, barely above a whisper. Alexander, she replied, her tone cool but not unfriendly. The sound of her voice sent a shiver through him, awakening 100 memories he hadn't realized were still so vivid in his mind. The boy looked up at them, his bright eyes darting between the two. You know each other? He asked innocently, clearly unaware of the storm of emotions passing between them. Sophia hesitated, glancing at Alexander before giving her son a soft smile. We used to, she said simply. Then, turning her attention fully to Alexander, she added, It's been a long time. Alexander nodded, swallowing the lump forming in his throat. It has, he agreed, his voice thick with the weight of unspoken words. The boy tugged at his mother's hand impatiently. Mom, show him the picture. You said it's from when you were younger, right? Sophia's cheeks flushed faintly, and she gave a small laugh, nervous, not amused. Charlie, that's enough, she said gently, ruffling the boy's hair. But Mom, Charlie protested, his energy undeterred. You said he. That's enough, Charlie, she repeated, this time with more firmness. Her eyes darted toward Alexander, silently apologizing for her son's lack of tact. Alexander crouched to Charlie's level, a soft smile on his face. Hey, buddy, he said warmly, your mom's right. Maybe we can talk about it later, okay? Charlie looked slightly disappointed but nodded anyway. Okay, he said with a shrug, before turning his attention back to chasing bubbles. Now that they were alone, even if only for a moment, the tension between Alexander and Sophia became almost palpable. He straightened, searching for the right words, but everything he wanted to say felt too big, too complicated for the moment. I didn't expect to see you, he said finally, breaking the silence. Sophia crossed her arms, her expression softening just enough to reveal a flicker of emotion. Neither did I, she admitted. It's been, almost 9 years? 8, Alexander corrected without thinking, the number coming to his lips before he could stop it. He saw a brief flicker of surprise cross Sophia's face, as if she hadn't expected him to keep track. Sophia nodded, her gaze shifting toward Charlie, who was now engrossed in his game with the bubbles. You've done well for yourself, she said, her tone neutral but tinged with something he couldn't quite place. Alexander exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. And you? How have you been? Her eyes flicked back to him, guarded once more. Busy. Raising a child doesn't leave much room for anything else. The mention of Charlie sent a wave of curiosity through Alexander. He glanced toward the boy, then back at Sophia, questions bubbling to the surface but remaining unspoken. The timing, the resemblance, could it be possible? But he didn't dare ask, not yet. I can see that, he said instead, his voice gentle. He seems like a great kid. Sophia smiled faintly, her defenses slipping for just a moment. He is, she said, pride evident in her tone. He's my whole world. Before either of them could say more, Charlie came bounding back, a large grin plastered across his face. Mom, can we go get ice cream now? He asked eagerly, tugging at her hand. Sophia looked down at him, her smile softening. In a little bit, sweetheart, she said. Then glancing back at Alexander, she added, we should go. It was good to see you, Alexander. He nodded, though his chest tightened at the thought of her walking away again, of the questions that would remain unanswered if he let her go now. Sophia, he said quickly, his voice firmer this time. Wait, can we talk? Just for a few minutes? Sophia hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. For a moment, it seemed she might refuse, but then she sighed softly. All right, she said, but not here. Her words carried a finality that left no room for argument. She turned to Charlie and knelt to his level. Why don't you go play for a little longer, okay? I'll be right here. Okay, Mom, Charlie said, dashing off without a second thought. Sophia straightened, nodding toward a quieter path leading out of the park. "Let's walk," she said. Alexander followed without hesitation, his heart pounding as he realized this was just the beginning of a much longer, much more complicated conversation. The park's lively atmosphere faded into the background as Alexander and Sophia walked along a quieter path, the only sounds between them being the crunch of gravel underfoot and the occasional distant laughter of children. The air was charged with tension, heavy with unspoken words. Alexander found himself stealing glances at her, as if to confirm that this wasn't some elaborate illusion conjured by his restless mind. Sophia kept her gaze ahead, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. Her posture was careful, deliberate, as if she were bracing herself for whatever was to come. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. "You know, I've imagined running into you so many times," he admitted, his voice low but steady. Sophia raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. "Have you?" she asked, her tone carrying a mix of curiosity and skepticism. He nodded, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I have, but in my mind, it was always easier. There weren't so many questions." At that, Sophia let out a soft laugh, short, almost bitter. "Life rarely makes things easy, Alexander," she replied. Her use of his full name struck him as formal, distant, a subtle reminder of the gap time had created between them. They turned a corner, the path leading them to a small clearing with a single weathered bench beneath a towering maple tree. Sophia stopped, gesturing toward it. "We can sit here," she said, her voice calm but tinged with resolve. As they sat down, Alexander studied her profile for a moment, noticing the way the fading sunlight played against her skin. Time had changed her, but it hadn't diminished the warmth and strength he'd always admired. "So," Sophia began, breaking the silence, "what is it you want to talk about?" He hesitated, unsure where to start. There were so many questions swirling in his mind, but one stood out above the rest. "That boy, Charlie," he said carefully, his words measured. "He's something special." Sophia's expression softened at the mention of her son, but her guard remained firmly in place. "He is," she agreed, her voice steady. "He's my everything." Alexander leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "I couldn't help but notice the timing," he said, his heart pounding as he edged closer to the question he was afraid to ask. "Sophia, how old is he?" She stiffened, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the bench. "He's 8, she said after a pause, her tone betraying nothing. 8. The number echoed in Alexander's mind, aligning perfectly with the timeline of their parting all those years ago. He drew in a slow breath, his voice soft but firm. "Is he?" Before he could finish the question, Sophia turned to face him fully, her eyes flashing with a mix of emotions, defiance, vulnerability, and something he couldn't quite name. "Don't," she said sharply, cutting him off. "Don't ask me that, Alexander." Her reaction only deepened his suspicions, but he forced himself to hold back, to respect the boundaries she was so clearly drawing. "All right," he said after a moment, his voice gentle. "I won't. Not yet." Sophia looked away, her expression conflicted. "This isn't the time or place for that conversation," she said, her voice softening slightly. "Charlie doesn't need to be caught in the middle of whatever this is." Alexander nodded, though the weight of his curiosity and the ache in his chest were nearly unbearable. "I understand," he said quietly. "But Sophia, I need to know. Not now, but eventually. Please." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't owe you anything, Alexander," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "You walked away. You chose your career, your empire, over us. And I had to pick up the pieces." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a moment he couldn't speak. She was right. He had made those choices, driven by ambition and the relentless pursuit of success. But hearing it from her now, seeing the pain it had caused, made him realize the true cost of his decisions. "I know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I let you down, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life." Sophia's expression softened just enough to reveal a flicker of the woman he had once known, the woman who had believed in him, even when he hadn't believed in himself. "I'm not here to punish you," she said quietly, "but I need to protect Charlie. His world is simple and happy, and I won't let anything complicate that." Alexander nodded again, his heart heavy. "I don't want to complicate anything," he said. I just want to understand." Sophia studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face as if trying to gauge the sincerity of his words. Finally, she sighed and stood. "We'll see," she said simply. She glanced toward the path they had come from, where Charlie's laughter echoed faintly in the distance. "We should get back," she said, her voice steady once more. "He'll be wondering where I am." Alexander rose to his feet, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. As they walked back toward the park, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that the truth, whatever it was, would change everything. When they reached Charlie, the boy greeted them with a wide grin, holding up a half-melted ice cream cone he had somehow managed to procure. "Mom, look what I got!" Sophia smiled, ruffling his hair. "Did you say thank you to the vendor?" she asked. "Yep," Charlie replied proudly. As Alexander watched the interaction, a pang of longing shot through him, a longing for something he couldn't yet name, but that felt closer now than it had in years. Sophia glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable. "Goodbye, Alexander," she said, her tone final. "Goodbye, Sophia," he replied, his voice tinged with a quiet determination. As he watched them walk away, Alexander knew one thing for certain. He wasn't ready to let this be the end. Alexander couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, memories of Sophia resurfaced, moments of laughter, stolen kisses, and the promises they had once made to each other. But now, a new face joined those memories. Charlie's. The boy's bright eyes, his animated energy, even the way he smiled, it all struck a chord too familiar to ignore. Alexander wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but the timeline, the resemblance, and Sophia's guarded reactions painted a picture he couldn't deny. By morning, Alexander had made up his mind. He needed answers. Sitting in his spacious penthouse office later that day, Alexander leaned back in his chair, staring out at the city skyline. The empire he had built felt hollow today, as if the glass and steel surrounding him couldn't offer the solace he craved. "Daniel," he called, pressing the intercom. Moments later, the door opened, and Daniel, his trusted aide of many years, entered. "Yes, Mr. Laurent?" Alexander hesitated for a moment. He wasn't used to involving anyone else in his personal matters, but this was different. "I need you to look into someone for me," he said finally. Daniel raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Of course. What's the name?" "Sophia Hart," Alexander replied, his voice steady but tinged with something unspoken. "And her son, Charlie." Daniel didn't ask questions. He never did. That was part of what made him so reliable. "I'll get started immediately," he said, retreating from the office with his usual efficiency. The following evening, Alexander sat in his living room, nursing a glass of whiskey as he waited for Daniel's report. When the knock on his door finally came, he stood, his pulse quickening. Daniel entered, holding a thin file. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, handing it over. "Sophia seems to have kept a low profile over the years, but I found what I could." Alexander opened the file, his eyes scanning the pages. There wasn't much, Sophia's work history, a few public records, but one detail leapt out at him like a beacon. Charlie's birth certificate. There it was, in plain black and white. Father, not listed. Alexander's grip tightened on the paper. The omission was glaring, and combined with the boy's age, it raised even more questions. Daniel cleared his throat. "I also checked into Sophia's timeline," he said cautiously. "She moved out of the city shortly after you two parted ways, around 8.5 years ago." Alexander nodded slowly, his suspicions solidifying. "And since then, she's been working steadily, mostly freelance writing and editing," Daniel replied. "Not much else stands out. No significant relationships or anything that suggests another father figure in Charlie's life." Alexander's chest tightened at that revelation. He set the file down and ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "Do you want me to dig deeper?" Daniel asked, his tone careful. Alexander shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "This is enough for now. Thank you, Daniel." As the door closed behind his aide, Alexander leaned back in his chair, staring at the birth certificate once more. "Why didn't you tell me, Sophia?" he murmured to himself. The next day, Alexander found himself driving to Sophia's neighborhood. He didn't have a plan, just an overwhelming need to see her again, to confront her with everything he had learned. When he arrived, he parked a block away and sat in the car for a moment, gathering his thoughts. The street was quiet, lined with modest homes and small gardens. It was a far cry from the luxury he was accustomed to, but it felt warm, lived in, a place where a child like Charlie could thrive. Finally, he stepped out and approached the house. His heart pounded as he knocked on the door. Sophia answered, her expression shifting from surprise to caution in an instant. "Alexander," she said, her voice steady but guarded. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," he said simply. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. "Charlie's inside," she said. "This isn't a good time." Alexander softened his tone. "Please, Sophia, just a few minutes. I promise I'll leave if you ask me to." Her eyes searched his face for a long moment before she sighed and stepped aside. "Fine," she said, leading him to a small sitting room. The room was cozy, filled with books, family photos, and Charlie's drawings taped to the walls. Alexander's gaze lingered on one in particular, a crayon drawing of a man, woman, and child holding hands under a bright sun. Sophia followed his gaze and frowned. "He's always drawing things like that," she said quietly. "He has a big imagination." Alexander turned to face her, his expression serious. "Sophia," he began, his voice steady but firm. "Is Charlie my son?" Her face paled and she took a step back, crossing her arms defensively. "Alexander, I told you." "Don't," he interrupted gently, his eyes searching hers. "Don't shut me out. I know the timing. I've seen the birth certificate, and I've seen him, Sophia. I can feel it." Her lips trembled, but she held her ground. "Even if he were," she began, her voice faltering, "it doesn't change anything. You made your choice, Alexander. You chose your career, your empire. I didn't want Charlie to grow up as some afterthought in your life." Her words hit him like a blow, but he refused to back down. "You didn't give me the chance to choose," he said, his voice laced with frustration. "You decided for me." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, her carefully constructed walls began to crumble. "I thought I was doing what was best," she whispered. Alexander stepped closer, his voice softening. "Sophia, I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, but if Charlie is my son, I need to know. Not for me, for him. He deserves the truth." She turned away, wrapping her arms around herself as she struggled to compose her emotions. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of them. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. "He's your son, Alexander." The words hung in the air, both a revelation and a confirmation of what he had suspected all along. His chest tightened, a mix of joy, sorrow, and guilt flooding through him. "I want to be part of his life," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. "I don't know what that looks like yet, but I need to try." Sophia turned to face him, her eyes red but resolute. "If you're serious about this," she said, "you have to understand that Charlie's happiness comes first, always." Alexander nodded, his gaze steady. "Always," he promised. The revelation haunted Alexander long after he left Sophia's home. Driving back to the city, his mind reeled with questions. Was he truly ready for this new chapter? A son, not just any child, but Charlie, a bright, inquisitive boy whose laughter and spirit had already carved a space in Alexander's guarded heart. But along with the wonder came doubts. Could he, a man who had spent years obsessively building his empire, learn to be a father? Could he make amends for the years he hadn't been there, even if he hadn't known? The next morning, Alexander sat in his office, staring at the city skyline, the weight of fatherhood pressing heavily on his shoulders. It was a strange feeling, foreign and exhilarating. He picked up his phone and dialed Daniel's number. "Daniel," he began, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "I need you to get in touch with a family lawyer, someone discreet and experienced, and find a child psychologist, someone who specializes in helping families navigate these kinds of situations." Daniel paused before answering. "Of course, sir. May I ask if this is about the boy you mentioned?" "Yes," Alexander replied. "And Daniel, I need to know how to do this right." Daniel's voice softened. "You'll figure it out, Mr. Laurent. You always do." Over the next few days, Alexander threw himself into learning everything he could about being a father. He read books, consulted professionals, and even watched parenting videos late into the night. His usually structured and calculated days were suddenly filled with questions about bedtime routines, emotional support, and building trust with a child. But no matter how much he prepared, Alexander knew the real challenge lay in building a connection with Charlie and earning Sophia's trust in the process. One evening, Alexander decided it was time to take the first real step. He called Sophia. "Alexander?" she answered. her tone guarded. "I'd like to spend some time with Charlie," he said directly, "if you'll allow it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Sophia sighed. "It's not that simple," she said. "Charlie doesn't know the truth yet. I haven't told him about you." Alexander's heart sank. "I understand," he said, his voice calm despite the disappointment he felt. "But maybe we could start small. I could spend time with him as a friend of yours, someone who wants to get to know him." Sophia hesitated. "I don't want him to get hurt," she said quietly. "Neither do I," Alexander replied. "That's why I'm asking for your trust, Sophia. Let me prove that I can be there for him." After a long silence, Sophia finally agreed. "Okay," she said. "We'll meet at the park tomorrow. But Alexander, please, take it slow." "I will," he promised. The next day, Alexander arrived at the park, his heart pounding in anticipation. He spotted Sophia and Charlie near the swings, the boys' laughter echoing across the playground. "Alex!" Charlie called out excitedly when he saw him, waving with both hands. Alexander smiled, his tension easing slightly at the boy's enthusiasm. "Hey, Charlie," he said as he approached. Sophia watched the interaction closely, her arms crossed protectively. "Remember," she murmured as Alexander reached them, "this is about Charlie, not us." Alexander nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. "I know," he said softly. The afternoon was filled with small, meaningful moments. Alexander pushed Charlie on the swings, helped him build a sandcastle, and even joined him in an impromptu game of tag. For the first time in years, Alexander felt a sense of joy that had nothing to do with success or wealth. Charlie's laughter was infectious, and his curiosity seemed boundless. "Do you like dogs?" he asked at one point, his eyes wide with excitement. "I do," Alexander replied. "Do you have one?" "Not yet," Charlie said with a dramatic sigh. "But I'm working on it. Mom says I have to prove I'm responsible first." Alexander chuckled. "That sounds fair. Maybe I can help you convince her." Charlie beamed, and Sophia, watching from a distance, couldn't help but smile despite herself. As the sun began to set, the three of them sat on a bench, enjoying ice cream cones. Charlie chatted animatedly about his favorite books and the robot he was building out of cardboard boxes at home. "I'll bring it next time so you can see," he said to Alexander. "I'd like that," Alexander replied, his heart swelling at the boy's openness. Sophia glanced at Alexander, her expression a mix of caution and something softer. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of the man she had fallen in love with years ago, the one who had always been kind and attentive before ambition had pulled him away. As they prepared to leave, Charlie tugged on Alexander's sleeve. "Will you come back?" he asked, his voice hopeful. Alexander crouched to meet the boy's gaze. "If it's okay with your mom, I'd like to," he said. Charlie turned to Sophia, his eyes pleading. Sophia hesitated, but eventually nodded. "We'll see," she said. "Thanks, Mom." Charlie exclaimed, running ahead to the car. Sophia turned to Alexander, her expression serious. "He likes you," she said quietly. "But don't make promises you can't keep, Alexander. He's been through enough." "I won't," Alexander assured her. "Thank you for giving me this chance." As he watched Sophia and Charlie drive away, Alexander felt a sense of hope he hadn't known in years. This was only the beginning, but it was a start, and for once, he was ready to fight for something more than his career. The days that followed were transformative, yet filled with uncertainty for Alexander. Though his interactions with Charlie grew more natural, a nagging question lingered in his mind. Was Charlie truly his son? Sophia's hesitation to share the full truth kept him on edge, but he was determined to uncover it, not out of suspicion, but out of a deep need to understand his place in the boy's life. Late one evening, Alexander sat in his penthouse, the city lights flickering through the vast windows. His thoughts were a storm. Memories of his time with Sophia, the years they had shared before ambition drove them apart, came flooding back. If Charlie was his, what did it mean for their fractured history? Unable to bear the uncertainty, Alexander reached for his phone and called Daniel. "Daniel," he said, his voice firm, "I need you to look into something for me. Quietly." "Of course, sir. What do you need?" "I need you to find out everything you can about Charlie, his birth records, any details about his early years. And," Alexander hesitated, the weight of his request sinking in, "I need to confirm if I'm his father." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Daniel replied, "Understood. I'll handle it discreetly." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity for Daniel, while Alexander tried to focus on his work and his growing relationship with Charlie. Despite his restless thoughts, he met with the boy several more times, taking him to museums, parks, and even a robotics workshop after learning of Charlie's fascination with building things. Charlie's boundless curiosity and enthusiasm brought out a side of Alexander he hadn't known existed. The boy's questions, ranging from, "What's the coolest thing you've ever built?" to, "Do you think robots can have feelings?" often left Alexander smiling and introspective. Sophia observed from the sidelines, her emotions a complex mix of relief and anxiety. She couldn't deny that Alexander was making an effort, but the wall she had built to protect herself and Charlie was hard to dismantle. One evening, as Alexander and Sophia sat on a park bench watching Charlie chase fireflies, Alexander decided to confront her. "Sophia," he began, his tone gentle but resolute, "I need to ask you something." She glanced at him warily. "What is it? Why haven't you told me the truth about Charlie?" Sophia stiffened, her hands clasping tightly in her lap. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean," Alexander said softly. "I've felt it since the first time I saw him. There's a connection. But you've been holding something back." Sophia's jaw tightened, and for a moment she said nothing. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders sagging as if under the weight of a long-kept secret. "Because I was afraid," she admitted quietly. "Afraid of what?" Alexander pressed, his voice filled with both compassion and urgency. "Afraid of what it would mean for Charlie, for you, for us." She looked at him, her eyes filled with pain. "When I found out I was pregnant, you were on the brink of everything you'd worked for. The company, the success, the life you always dreamed of. I didn't want to burden you with something that would change everything." Alexander's heart clenched. "Sophia? You didn't think I had the right to know?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I thought I was doing the right thing. You were so focused, so determined. I didn't want to be the reason you gave up on your dreams." "But Charlie isn't a burden," Alexander said, his voice trembling. "He's amazing, and you didn't have to go through this alone." Sophia wiped at her tears, her voice cracking as she replied, "It wasn't just about you, Alex. I didn't know if you'd want to be involved. And by the time you were everywhere, on magazine covers, at award ceremonies, I convinced myself that it was better this way, that Charlie and I would be fine on our own." "But you kept a photo of me," Alexander pointed out gently. "Why?" Sophia's lips trembled as she whispered, "Because I never stopped caring, no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise." The confession left them both shaken. Alexander felt a mix of anger, sorrow, and guilt. He couldn't blame Sophia entirely. His own choices had led to their estrangement. But he also couldn't ignore the years he had lost with Charlie. "Sophia," he said after a long silence, "I'm here now, and I want to be part of Charlie's life, but I need to know for sure. Is he my son?" Sophia hesitated, her eyes searching his. Finally, she nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's yours." Alexander exhaled, a wave of emotion crashing over him. Relief, joy, and a profound sense of responsibility filled him all at once. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for telling me, for raising him to be such an incredible boy." Sophia looked at him, her guarded expression softening. "He deserves to know, Alex, but you have to promise me one thing." "Anything." Alexander said. "Promise me you'll put him first," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "No matter what." "I will," Alexander vowed, his gaze unwavering. "From now on, he comes first." As they sat in the fading light of the park, a fragile understanding began to form between them. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would challenge them both, but had the potential to bring healing and hope. The weight of Sophia's confession lingered in Alexander's chest as he drove home that evening. Charlie was his son. His son. The words felt surreal, almost too enormous to comprehend. For years, Alexander had thrown himself into his work, building an empire and accumulating wealth that he once thought would fill the void left by his sacrifices. Now, he realized that no achievement or accolade could compare to the simple joy of watching Charlie laugh or the pride of knowing he was part of the boy's vibrant spirit. But Sophia's plea echoed in his mind. "Promise me you'll put him first." The next day, Alexander stood in his office, staring out at the sprawling city skyline. His reflection in the glass seemed foreign. the polished and powerful CEO suddenly looking more vulnerable than ever. Daniel entered, his usual professional demeanor tempered with a hint of curiosity. "You called for me, sir?" Daniel asked. Alexander turned, his expression resolute. "Cancel my meetings for the rest of the week." Daniel raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for an explanation. "I need to focus on something far more important," Alexander continued. "I need to figure out how to be the father Charlie deserves. And I need to make things right with Sophia." Daniel's lips quirked in a rare smile. "That's a good move, sir. Let me know how I can assist." Later that afternoon, Alexander arrived unannounced at Sophia's small but cozy home. She opened the door, startled to see him there, but quickly masked her surprise with a guarded look. "Alexander," she said warily, "what are you doing here?" "I wanted to talk," he said earnestly. "About Charlie. About us." Sophia hesitated, glancing toward the living room, where Charlie was sprawled on the floor, engrossed in a colorful puzzle. Finally, she stepped aside, letting Alexander in. They sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound between them. Sophia folded her arms, her protective stance unchanged. "What is it you want to say?" she asked. Alexander leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "I want to be part of Charlie's life, not just as someone he sees occasionally, but as his father. I know I've missed so much already, but I want to make up for it." Sophia's expression softened, but her eyes still held a flicker of doubt. "It's not that simple, Alex. Being a father isn't just about showing up. It's about consistency, sacrifice, and love, every single day." "I know," Alexander said, "and I'm ready for that. I've already started making changes to my life. My priorities are shifting. He's my priority now." Sophia studied him for a long moment, her defenses wavering. "Charlie doesn't know yet," she admitted. "I haven't told him that you're his father." Alexander's breath caught. "Why not?" "Because I wanted to be sure," she said quietly. "Sure that you were ready. Sure that you wouldn't walk away." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he nodded, understanding the pain behind them. "I won't walk away, Sophia. I promise you that." As the conversation lingered, a soft voice interrupted them. "Hey, Mom, Alex?" They both turned to see Charlie standing in the doorway, his puzzle piece in hand and a curious expression on his face. "What are you guys talking about?" Sophia smiled gently. "Come here, sweetheart." Charlie approached, looking between the two adults. Sophia placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice tender but steady. "Charlie, there's something very important we need to tell you." The boy's brow furrowed, but he nodded, his wide eyes trusting. "What is it?" Sophia glanced at Alexander, giving him the space to speak. Alexander crouched down to meet Charlie at eye level, his heart pounding. "Charlie," he began, his voice soft, "you know how much I've enjoyed spending time with you, right?" Charlie nodded eagerly. "Yeah, it's been awesome. You're like the coolest grown-up ever." Alexander chuckled, the boy's innocence warming his heart. "Well, there's a reason I feel such a special connection with you. It's because I'm your dad." Charlie froze, his wide eyes blinking in surprise. "My? Dad?" he repeated, his voice small. "Yes," Alexander said, his voice firm but filled with emotion. "I didn't know until recently, but you're my son, Charlie, and I'm so happy to have you in my life." For a moment, Charlie said nothing, his young mind processing the revelation. Then, to Alexander's surprise, the boy broke into a wide grin. "That's so cool," he exclaimed, throwing his arms around Alexander's neck. "I have a dad." Alexander hugged him tightly, his throat thick with emotion. "Yes, you do," he whispered, "and I promise I'll always be here for you." Sophia watched the scene unfold, tears streaming down her cheeks. In that moment, she saw not the ruthless businessman who had once prioritized his career over their love, but a man who was genuinely trying to be better, for Charlie and for her. As the evening wore on, the three of them sat together, laughing, sharing stories, and building a bond that had been missing for far too long. For the first time in years, their small family felt whole. But Sophia knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be complicated, filled with challenges and compromises. Still, as she watched Alexander and Charlie playfully bicker over the puzzle pieces, she allowed herself a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could forge a future together, one built on trust, love, and the strength they found in each other. In the weeks that followed the emotional revelation, Alexander found himself navigating an entirely new chapter of his life. Being a father wasn't something he could delegate, strategize, or negotiate like a business deal. It required presence, patience, and a willingness to let go of control, qualities that didn't come naturally to a man like him. But for Charlie, Alexander was determined to learn. Their bond deepened with each passing day. At first, their time together was structured. Alexander would pick Charlie up for outings that felt more like carefully planned events than casual hangouts. He took Charlie to the city's largest aquarium, where the boy's face lit up at the sight of the glowing jellyfish tanks. They visited the planetarium, where Charlie peppered the guide with endless questions about stars and black holes. And on weekends, they went to the park, where Alexander discovered the simple joy of kicking a soccer ball around or helping Charlie fly a kite. One Saturday morning, Charlie bounded out of the house, clutching a small, well-worn book in his hands. "Hey, Alex, a dad," he corrected himself with a sheepish grin, still getting used to the new title. "Can we build something today? I found this old book with DIY projects, and there's this really cool robot arm we can make." Alexander knelt to examine the book, flipping through its pages. It was a child's guide to basic engineering, filled with colorful diagrams and step-by-step instructions. "A robot arm, huh?" he said, his lips quirking into a smile. "That sounds ambitious." Charlie's eyes sparkled. "But you're a genius with tech stuff. You could totally do it." Alexander laughed, feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. "All right, let's do it. But you're the boss. I'm just the assistant." Charlie's laughter rang out as they headed to a nearby hardware store to gather supplies. Alexander couldn't remember the last time he had felt so relaxed, so unburdened by the pressures of work. Watching Charlie dart excitedly through the aisles, rattling off ideas and plans, reminded him of his own childhood curiosity, the spark that had ignited his passion for technology. Back at Sophia's house, they set up a makeshift workshop at the kitchen table. As the hours ticked by, the room filled with the sounds of whirring drills, clinking tools, and Charlie's enthusiastic commentary. Sophia popped in occasionally to check on them, her expression softening at the sight of Alexander and Charlie bent over their project, their heads almost touching as they worked together. "Are you sure you're not building a rocket ship in there?" Sophia teased as she brought them a tray of snacks. "Not yet," Charlie replied with a grin. "But maybe next time." Alexander chuckled, wiping his hands on a rag. "He's got big plans. We'll need a bigger table soon." Sophia lingered for a moment, her gaze lingering on Alexander. There was something different about him now, a gentleness, a humility that hadn't been there before. She didn't say anything, but her heart swelled with a mix of hope and trepidation. By evening, the robot arm was complete, or as complete as a DIY project supervised by an 8-year-old could be. It was clunky and a little wobbly, but to Charlie, it was a masterpiece. "This is the coolest thing ever," he exclaimed, his face glowing with pride. "Thanks, Dad." Alexander's chest tightened at the word. He hadn't realized how much it meant to him until now. "You did most of the work," he said, ruffling Charlie's hair. "I just followed orders." "That's because you're a good assistant," Charlie said with a cheeky grin. Sophia laughed softly from the doorway, leaning against the frame. "I think you might have some competition at work, Alex." Alexander turned to her, his smile faltering slightly as their eyes met. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of how far they had come and how much further they had to go. He nodded, acknowledging her silent support. Over time, their routines became less about orchestrated activities and more about simply being together. Charlie began asking Alexander for help with homework, eager to impress him with his budding math skills. They spent afternoons tinkering with gadgets and evenings reading adventure stories. And sometimes they just talked about school, friends, and dreams for the future. "Do you think I could be an inventor someday?" Charlie asked one night as they sat on the porch, watching the stars. Alexander looked at him, his heart swelling with pride. "I don't think it, Charlie. I know it. You've got the imagination and the drive. That's all it takes." "Do you think we could invent something together? Like for real?" Alexander smiled. "I'd like that. What do you have in mind?" Charlie's face lit up as he launched into a wild idea about a robot that could do chores and make pancakes. Alexander laughed, but he listened intently, encouraging every detail. For the first time in years, he felt like he was building something meaningful, Not a company or a product, but a connection that would last a lifetime. One evening, as Alexander prepared to leave after spending the day with Charlie, Sophia walked him to the door. "He's happier now," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of vulnerability. "He talks about you constantly, about all the things you've taught him, the things you do together." Alexander turned to her, his expression serious. "He's changed me, Sophia. I didn't know how much I was missing until I met him, until I saw you again." Sophia hesitated, her guard wavering. "I'm glad he has you," she said finally. "But I'm scared, Alex. What happens if you can't keep this up? If work pulls you away again?" "I won't let that happen," Alexander said firmly. "I know I've made mistakes, but I'm not that man anymore. Charlie comes first, and so do you." The weight of his words hung in the air, their meaning undeniable. Sophia searched his eyes, finding something she hadn't seen in years: sincerity, commitment, and a willingness to fight for the family they could become. As Alexander stepped out into the cool night air, he felt a quiet sense of triumph. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it. For Charlie, for Sophia, for the chance to build something real. In the weeks following that conversation, the dynamics between Alexander and Sophia slowly began to shift. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a mix of hope and hesitation. Alexander was doing his best to prove that his newfound commitment to Charlie wasn't just a passing phase. Every day, he showed up, not just as the tech mogul who once commanded boardrooms and closed deals, but as a father, present, engaged, and eager to learn. However, despite the progress they'd made, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty that lingered in her heart. She had seen Alexander's drive before, the way he could become consumed by his work, and a part of her wondered if his promises to prioritize their family were just words. She didn't want to fall back into old patterns, especially now that Charlie was so attached to him. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Charlie bouncing excitedly between them as he told them about his latest school project, Sophia couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in her chest any longer. She needed to ask the question that had been hanging over them for days. "Alex," she began softly, looking up from her tea, "how are you really doing with all of this? With being a father, I mean. I know you're trying, but I need to know that you're in this for the long haul. I can't go through the heartbreak again, for Charlie's sake." Alexander looked at her, his expression sincere but heavy with the weight of her words. He had been waiting for this moment, knowing that their relationship still had a fragile thread connecting them. It was one thing to promise to be there for Charlie, but another to convince Sophia that he could be the partner she needed. "I'm not going to lie," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's hard. I've spent years building something that defines me, and now I have to redefine myself in ways I never expected. But what I've realized is that everything I've done up until now, everything I thought was important, doesn't mean a damn thing if I'm not there for my son, or for you." Sophia's eyes softened slightly, but she didn't let her guard down completely. "You say that now, but I've heard those words before. The promises, the good intentions. It's easy to say the right things when everything is calm. But when things get difficult, what happens then?" Alexander took a deep breath, leaning forward. "I'm not asking for a free pass, Sophia. I know I have to prove myself to you, to Charlie. I'm ready to do whatever it takes." She studied him for a long moment, her mind warring between the hope she desperately wanted to hold on to and the fear that had always kept her from fully trusting him. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer this time. "I want to believe you, Alex. I really do. But it's going to take more than just spending time with Charlie. It's about consistency. It's about showing up even when it's hard, even when you have to choose between your work and being here with us." "I understand," Alexander said, his voice firm. "And I'm ready. I'm committed. I won't make excuses anymore." For a long time, neither of them spoke, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. It was a fragile truce, but it was a start. Sophia could see the sincerity in Alexander's eyes. She knew that he meant what he said. But she also knew that words alone wouldn't heal the past. It was going to take time. Trust couldn't be rushed. It had to be earned. Over the next few weeks, the foundation of trust began to solidify between them, though not without its challenges. Alexander made a conscious effort to balance his work and personal life. something that hadn't come naturally to him in the past. He began delegating more tasks at the office, trusting his team to handle the day-to-day operations. He took a step back from his usual high-pressure meetings and business trips, realizing that his family needed him more than the next big deal. His dedication to Charlie grew with each passing day. He attended every parent-teacher conference, sat through endless soccer games, and became Charlie's #1 fan at his school science fair. They continued to work on their projects together, building things with their hands and minds, each creation a new way for Alexander to show Charlie that he was there, not just physically, but emotionally as well. For the first time, Alexander wasn't just investing in his company or his own success. He was investing in his relationship with his son. One afternoon, after picking up Charlie from school, they went to a local cafe, their favorite weekend spot. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light through the cafe windows. Charlie chattered excitedly about a new project he was working on at school, a model of the solar system, and Alexander listened, his full attention on the boy. As they finished their sandwiches, Charlie paused, looking up at Alexander with wide, serious eyes. "Dad?" he asked, his voice small but filled with curiosity. "Are you ever going to go away again?" Alexander's heart clenched at the question. He had feared this moment, when Charlie would voice the doubt that had surely been building inside of him. Alexander had been in and out of his life for so long that it was natural for the boy to wonder if this was just another fleeting phase. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not going anywhere, Charlie. Not this time. I'm here for you, and I'll always be here." Charlie seemed to accept that, nodding and returning to his sandwich, but Alexander saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He knew the road ahead would be filled with small moments like this. Moments when Charlie would test his commitment, testing the trust that was slowly being rebuilt. But Alexander wasn't afraid anymore. He was ready to face the challenges, to be the father Charlie needed. And he would do whatever it took to make sure he never had to question that again. Later that evening, after Charlie had gone to bed, Sophia and Alexander sat together in the quiet of the living room, the soft hum of the television the only sound between them. Sophia looked at him, her eyes searching. "I saw what happened today," she said softly. "The way you answered him. You're doing it, Alex. You're showing up. For him, for both of us." Alexander reached for her hand, his thumb gently tracing the back of her fingers. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I'm willing to fight for it. For this family. For Charlie." Sophia met his gaze, her own heart swelling with a mixture of hope and relief. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But they were both learning to trust again, one day at a time. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that they had a future, that maybe, just maybe, they could build something that would last. The days were growing warmer, and the light of early summer had begun to fill the city with a sense of possibility. For the first time in what felt like years, the future didn't seem as uncertain for Alexander, Sophia, and Charlie. But despite the progress they had made, there lingered an undercurrent of apprehension. The truth had been revealed, and the foundation of their lives together was slowly being rebuilt. But the fear of what might come next, of how the truth would ultimately affect them, still loomed. Alexander knew it, Sophia knew it, and even Charlie seemed to sense the weight of the unspoken questions that hung over their home. As the days passed, Charlie's acceptance of Alexander as his father had blossomed into a tender and unshakable bond. But with each step forward, Alexander's internal conflict grew. He had promised Charlie that he would always be there. But how would the boy react when he found out the full truth? The truth of the years lost, of the hidden secrets that had shaped their lives. For Alexander, the question wasn't whether he could handle the truth. It was whether Charlie could. And more than that, he wondered about Sophia. Despite the growing warmth between them, there was still a delicate, fragile balance in their relationship. What would she think when the past was laid bare for Charlie to see? Could their fragile bond withstand the truth of his paternity? Would it all come crumbling down? One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a soft glow across the city, Alexander and Sophia sat on the porch, Charlie playing quietly in the yard with his dog. The air was thick with the scent of blooming flowers and fresh grass, but there was an unmistakable tension between them. Sophia turned to Alexander, her expression serious, her voice low. "We need to talk." Alexander's stomach tightened at the words. He had been dreading this conversation, knowing it was coming but unsure of how to navigate it. "About what?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "About Charlie," Sophia said softly, her eyes fixed on the boy, who was lost in his game. "We've both been pretending like everything's fine, but we need to tell him. We can't keep living in the shadows of the past. He deserves to know the truth, even if it's hard." Alexander's heart clenched. He had hoped naively that they could avoid this moment, that they could move forward, forgetting the years that had been lost. But deep down, he knew Sophia was right. Charlie deserved the truth. He nodded slowly, his eyes drawn to Charlie, who was now laughing as his dog chased after a tennis ball. "I know. I don't know how he'll take it. He's so happy now, Sophia. I don't want to hurt him." Sophia's voice softened, but there was an edge of determination to it. "He's going to need us both. We can't protect him from the truth forever. It's time we face it, together." Alexander looked out into the distance, his mind racing. Could they really do this? Could they really shatter the delicate bubble they had created around Charlie and tell him that the man he had grown to love as his father had once been a stranger, an absent figure in his life? And then there was the fear of Sophia's response. Would she be able to forgive him for what had happened in the past? Would she be able to move forward with him, knowing everything that had been hidden? "I don't want to lose him," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia reached over and placed her hand on his. "You won't. We won't. But we have to face our fears, Alex. For him. For us." The conversation hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Both of them knew what had to be done. The fear of the unknown was overwhelming, but they couldn't let it rule their lives any longer. They had built something fragile, something worth protecting, and now they needed to be honest with themselves and with Charlie. The next morning, they decided to tell Charlie together. They knew it couldn't wait any longer. They sat down with him in the living room, the soft light of the morning streaming in through the windows. Charlie, always eager for their attention, sat between them, his small hands clutching his favorite book, a grin on his face. Alexander cleared his throat, his heart pounding in his chest. "Charlie, buddy, we need to talk to you about something important," he said gently. Charlie tilted his head, sensing the seriousness in their tone. "What's up, Dad?" Sophia's voice wavered slightly as she spoke, her eyes locked on Charlie's. "There's something we need to tell you. Something about the past, something that's a little complicated." Charlie looked at them, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Alexander took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "Charlie, I want you to know that I'm here for you. I've always been here, even if you didn't know it. But the truth is, I wasn't there when you were born. I didn't know you existed until recently." Charlie blinked, his confusion growing. But you're my dad." Sophia placed her hand on his shoulder, her voice trembling but firm. "You're right, Charlie. You are our son. But the way we got here, it wasn't the way most families do. And there's something you need to understand about why I wasn't there at the beginning." The weight of the words hung in the air, and Charlie's eyes darted between them, still unsure of what they were trying to say. Alexander's heart broke as he saw the vulnerability in his son's gaze. "Charlie, you were born into a world that I wasn't ready for. I wasn't the man I am now. I was focused on my work, on building my empire, but I wasn't there for you when you needed me the most. I'm so sorry." For a long moment, Charlie was silent. His small face was a mixture of confusion, hurt, and curiosity. And then, in the quietest voice, he spoke. "Does that mean you're not my dad anymore?" Alexander's heart clenched. "No, buddy, that's not what I mean. I'm your dad. I always will be." Sophia gently wiped a tear from her cheek as she watched Charlie process the words. "It's okay to be confused or upset, sweetie. We've all been through a lot. But no matter what, we are a family, and nothing's going to change that." Charlie nodded slowly, still digesting the news, but there was a softness in his expression now, as though he was beginning to understand. "So, you're not going to leave?" Alexander smiled through the ache in his chest. "No, Charlie, I'm not going anywhere. I'm here to stay." For a moment, the room was still. The weight of their confession hung in the air, but there was something more important beneath it. The undeniable bond between father and son, the foundation of a relationship that was being rebuilt with honesty, patience, and love. And despite the fears, despite the uncertainty, Alexander knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anything tear them apart again. The days following their conversation with Charlie were a whirlwind of emotions. What had started as an inevitable confrontation, the truth they had long tried to avoid, had become the catalyst for something far greater than any of them had imagined. There was still uncertainty, lingering fears about how the past would continue to shape their future. But for the first time in a long time, Alexander felt something he had thought was lost forever: hope. Charlie, to their relief, seemed to take the revelation in stride. His acceptance had been nothing short of remarkable. He was still the same playful, curious boy, his laughter echoing through their home every day. But beneath that childlike innocence, Alexander could see that Charlie was quietly processing everything, perhaps in ways he couldn't fully understand yet. The weight of the truth was there, in his quiet moments and his questions. But he was, at least for now, embracing the new reality they had created. Sophia, on the other hand, was a more complicated puzzle. Her feelings had been, and still were, a mixture of relief and sorrow. The relief came from the fact that they had finally faced their fears and told Charlie the truth. The sorrow, however, stemmed from the years of secrets, the time that had been lost, and the hurt that still clung to their past. But there was a softness in her gaze when she looked at Alexander, a tenderness that hadn't been there before. It was as if the walls between them were starting to crumble, piece by piece, and though the cracks were still visible, the foundation was slowly being rebuilt. It was slow, painstaking work, but it was work that they were willing to put in, for each other, for Charlie, and for the family they were becoming. One evening, as the sky shifted from soft pinks to deep purples, Alexander found himself sitting in the backyard with Sophia. The air was cooler now, the first signs of autumn creeping in, but it was still warm enough to linger outside. Charlie had gone to bed hours ago, exhausted from the day's adventures, and the house was quiet, finally quiet, in a way that felt peaceful. Sophia sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. They didn't speak for a long while, content to simply be in each other's presence. The silence between them was no longer heavy, no longer full of unspoken words that threatened to drown them. It was comfortable, filled with a kind of understanding that neither of them had anticipated. "I never thought we'd get here," Sophia said finally, her voice soft but steady. "Not after everything that happened." Alexander turned to look at her, his gaze filled with emotion. "Neither did I. But here we are, aren't we?" Sophia smiled faintly, her eyes distant as she watched the stars beginning to twinkle overhead. "You've changed, Alex. I don't know if you see it, but I do. You're not the same man who walked away from me all those years ago. You're not the same man who ignored everything that mattered, who chose work over family." "I know," he replied quietly, his voice thick with regret. "I can't change the past, Sophia. I can't undo the mistakes I made. But I can do better now. I want to do better, for you, for Charlie, for all of us." She turned to him then, her gaze searching his face as though she were looking for something, perhaps an assurance, perhaps the final piece of the puzzle that would tell her that they were truly ready to move forward. "You're not perfect," she said, a hint of a smile in her voice. "But you're trying, and that's all I can ask for." Alexander's heart swelled at her words. He knew he didn't deserve her forgiveness. Not after all he had done. But here she was, sitting beside him, willing to give him a chance to prove that he could be the man she once believed in. The man he could still be. "I'll keep trying," he vowed, his voice firm with determination. "Every day." Sophia's smile deepened, a warmth spreading through her eyes. She leaned in and kissed him softly on the cheek, a gesture so simple, yet so full of meaning. "I know you will." The weeks that followed were a time of steady transformation. For the first time in their lives, Alexander, Sophia, and Charlie began to build a life that was grounded in honesty and openness. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, moments where the weight of the past seemed to threaten their fragile peace. But there were also moments of joy, moments of laughter, moments of connection that reminded them of the reasons they had come together in the first place. Charlie thrived in this new atmosphere of truth. His relationship with Alexander deepened with each passing day, their bond growing stronger as they spent more time together. They played catch in the yard, took trips to the park, and shared simple moments that were more meaningful than anything Alexander had experienced before. Charlie was no longer just his son in name, but in heart. And Alexander couldn't help but marvel at the boy's resilience, the way he had embraced everything, no matter how difficult or painful the truth had been. Charlie was strong, stronger than he had given him credit for, and Alexander vowed to be the father he had always needed. Sophia, too, seemed to soften more with each passing day. She had always been the backbone of their family, the one who held everything together. But now she was learning to lean on Alexander as well. Their relationship, though still healing, was slowly being rebuilt with trust, with understanding, and with a commitment to move forward, no matter what it took. They were no longer just two people sharing a life. They were partners, working together to create something better, something stronger. One afternoon, Alexander found himself sitting with Sophia at their kitchen table, both of them looking over some papers, discussing plans for their future. The house was quiet, but the quiet was no longer oppressive. It was a comfort. Their life together was beginning to take shape, and it felt right. It felt like home. "I've been thinking," Alexander said, his voice hesitant, "about the future, about what we want, what we need." Sophia looked up at him, her eyes warm and open. "What do you mean?" "I want us to be a family, Sophia. I want to make sure that Charlie knows he's loved, that we're here for him. And I want to be the man who shows him what it means to be a father. But more than that, I want to be the man who shows you that you can trust me, that you don't have to do this alone." Sophia reached across the table, taking his hand in hers, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You're already doing it, Alex. Every day, and that's enough." For the first time in a long while, Alexander felt a peace he had never known. He didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging. But as he looked at Sophia, as he thought about the family they were becoming, he knew that they would face whatever came next together. And that, in itself, was enough. The crisp autumn air carried the promise of change, and as the sun began to set on another quiet evening, Alexander, Sophia, and Charlie found themselves once again in the park where everything had started. It had become a symbol for them now, a place of reunions, of truths spoken, of healing. The same oak tree stood tall, its branches now touched with gold and orange, and beneath it, the echoes of their laughter rang louder than ever before. Charlie, as always, was full of energy, chasing after his dog, his laughter mixing with the rustling of the leaves. Alexander watched him, a soft smile tugging at his lips, as he marveled at the boy's boundless joy, the way he could run and play without a care in the world. To see him this happy, to know that he was a part of this new life, filled Alexander with a sense of peace he had never known before. It was a peace that had seemed so elusive for so long. Sophia was beside him, her presence as steady as the ground beneath their feet. She had always been the rock in their family, the one who held everything together. But now, there was something more in the way she looked at him. Something softer, something that told him she had forgiven him. And that, more than anything, made his heart swell with gratitude. "You know," she said, her voice breaking the comfortable silence between them, "this feels different now. Like everything is finally right." Alexander turned to her, meeting her gaze, and for the first time in years, he truly understood what she meant. There had been so much uncertainty, so much pain, but now, standing here with her, with Charlie by their side, he knew they were on the other side of it. The storms they had weathered were behind them, and ahead of them stretched a future they were both ready to face. "I've always wanted this," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "A family. A real family, with you, with Charlie. I didn't understand it before, but I see it now. I see what really matters." Sophia's eyes softened, and she reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. There were no more walls between them, no more unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. They had rebuilt their foundation, brick by brick, through hard conversations, painful truths, and a willingness to fight for what they had. And now, standing here in the fading light of day, they had something they had both longed for: hope. "Me too," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We've been through a lot, but this feels like a new beginning." Alexander nodded, his heart swelling at her words. He didn't need grand gestures or promises of perfection. What they had now in this moment was enough. They were together, they were whole, and that was all that mattered. Charlie bounded over to them, his face flushed with excitement. "Look, look, I found a cool stick," he exclaimed, holding up a large branch triumphantly. Sophia and Alexander both laughed, their hearts lighter than they had been in years. For a moment, the weight of the world seemed to fall away, leaving only the joy of being a family. It was a joy they hadn't known they had been missing, but now that it was here, it felt like everything. Alexander reached down to ruffle Charlie's hair, his eyes softening with affection. "You're something else, kid." Charlie beamed, his smile infectious. "Can we go home and play some more, Dad?" The words still felt new to Alexander. But as he looked at Charlie, his heart swelling with love, he knew it was right. "Of course," he said, his voice steady, his heart full. As they began to walk back toward their car, the world around them seemed to fade into the background. There were no more doubts, no more questions. The future, uncertain as it always would be, no longer felt like a source of fear. Instead, it felt like a promise of love, of family, and of a life they would build together, step by step. That evening, as they settled into their home, the sound of Charlie's laughter filled every room. The house that had once felt so empty now felt full of life, full of love, full of hope. As Alexander and Sophia sat on the couch watching their son play, there was a sense of peace that washed over them both. They had come so far, each of them carrying their own scars, but now they were together, healed in ways they hadn't thought possible. And in that moment, with the warmth of the evening sun casting a golden glow across the room, Alexander realized that this was the life he had always wanted. This was the life he had fought for. And though the road ahead might still have its challenges, he knew that as long as they were together, they could face anything. Sophia leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, and Alexander wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace. "We made it," he murmured, his voice filled with quiet awe. Sophia smiled, her eyes soft with affection. "Yeah, we did." And as the night settled in, with the sounds of Charlie's laughter echoing in the background, they both knew that this was only the beginning. The journey ahead was theirs to shape, and together they would create a future filled with love, with hope, and with a family that had been forged in the fires of their past, but was now stronger than ever. With every step, Alexander, Sophia, and Charlie's small family rose from the brokenness of their past, building a new future filled with hope. They learned to forgive, face the truth, and accept the mistakes that could never be undone. It was through these challenges that they discovered the true value of love and connection. For love is never a straight path, but a journey full of hardships, sometimes wounds that take time to heal. But when you stand strong, when you overcome together, that love is not only the bond between people, but also the force that drives the creation of miracles. Their family may not be perfect, but it is precisely that imperfection that gave it strength and beauty. And so, under the warm light of autumn evenings, they walked forward, writing their own story. A story not just of rebirth, but of understanding, acceptance, and unconditional love. For in this life, there is nothing more beautiful than finding a real family, a place where you can be yourself, where you are loved even with your scars and imperfect past. They had started over, but this time it was together, side by side. And that was the beginning of a happy life, a new journey full of joy and love. Thank you for watching. Thank you so much for sticking with us through the entire journey of this story. Your time and attention mean the world, and we hope you enjoyed every twist and turn along the way. If you loved the story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our future stories and updates. Your support helps us keep creating more content that we hope resonates with you. Feel free to leave a comment and let us know what you think. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback. Once again, thank you for being part of this amazing journey. Until next time, take care and stay tuned for more exciting adventures.